Today's episode is a crossover with our sister podcast, To Save Us from Hell, a weekly chat show about the UN. I'm joined by co-host Anjali Dayal, who is an international relations professor at Fordham University, and Richard Gowan, UN director at the International Crisis Group. We spoke on Tuesday afternoon, a few hours after Biden's farewell UNGA address. We cover a good deal of ground in this episode, including Biden's speech, Antonio Guterres' address, and some drama at the Summit of the Future, and other happenings around the UN during this very busy high-level week. I always love chatting with Richard and Anjali, and we've done this many years now around this time. So enjoy and be sure to subscribe to Save Us from Hell by visiting globaldispatches.org and following the links there or in the show notes.
I think one should say that if people are rushing away from this podcast, downloading the Pact for the Future and expecting to discover a amazingly crystalline vision of the future of the UN, they may be disappointed, because it is a UN document, and you can see going line by line how individual phrases were wordsmithed, almost to the point of incomprehensibility.
Welcome to Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch, joined as always by...
I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor at Fordham University, where I teach and do research and write about the United Nations.
And Anjali, it would not be UNGA if we weren't joined by our guest today, Richard Gowan. Richard, say hello and introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Richard Gowan, the United Nations Director for the International Crisis Group, which is a global conflict prevention organization, and I run its UN liaison work.
And I must say, this is probably like the third year in a row the three of us have gotten together to chat during UNGA. So thank you all. This conversation, our annual chats, preceded the launch of To Save Us from Hell, but now I'm glad that we're bringing you into the fold, Richard.
It's good to be on board. I thought it was about 10 years ago that we started doing this.
Well, you and I, Richard, on Global Dispatches, you know what? The time just flies.
That time has lost all meaning for those of us who are sort of stuck in the middle of the General Assembly, so I can't be sure.
Like our fluid understanding of time is a direct consequence that you and I and the three of us were speaking on the Tuesday of UNGA, the busiest day of the busiest week in the year for UN watchers like us three. It is the day that the President of the United States delivers his address, and we'll discuss Biden's address. We'll also discuss Antonio Guterres' address. But first, Richard, I wanted to kick off by asking you about the Summit of the Future. So there was, as far as I can tell, high drama on Sunday when it came time to formally vote and accept the Pact of the Future, the key outcome document. As I understand it, Russia raised some last-minute objections, which threatened to kind of throw a wrench in the whole process. Can you explain, as best we know, what happened? And also, why do you suspect Russia made these last-minute changes that might have upset the entire, months of negotiations leading up to the adoption of the Pact of the Future?
Well, I think it's worth saying that the weeks before the Summit of the Future had involved a lot of very difficult negotiations on lots of aspects of the pact, and pretty much all UN members had raised concerns about some aspect of the pact or another in early September. But this is quite normal, and as time went by and as the summit got closer, most states and groups indicated that they were happy with the document that was emerging. And the US, for example, had lots of red lines about language in the text relating to the international financial institutions, but it indicated that it was happy with where things had landed. But what really took diplomats by surprise, it was that in the last week before the summit, Russia, with a very few other states, continued to hang tough. And the Russians were saying in private meetings that they would be willing to torpedo the pact for the future completely, that they didn't feel it was essential to get an agreement. By the weekend, all the other holdouts were basically out of the picture, but Russia suddenly buddied up two of its usual chums, Belarus and Nicaragua, and suggested an amendment to the text, which basically would have said that states didn't have to observe the text at all. It was quite nastily drafted. And this really infuriated a lot of developing countries that, under other circumstances, might have sided with Russia. And on Sunday morning, when the Russians did not back down, the African group, with Congo as its representative, put down a resolution saying that there would be no further discussion of Russia's text.
Which I think is a procedurally kind of genius. Instead of going down the let's vote on the Russia amendment rabbit hole, which could have been divisive, Congo basically came to the rescue and said, actually, let's just ignore Russia's text, and ignoring Russia's text to a vote.
Yeah, and it was, I think, very important that the African group, which has a lot of leverage in this sort of negotiation, said this rather than a Western country that was an obvious opponent of Russia. We saw some Latin American countries supporting the African proposal, and then lo and behold, the General Assembly voted by a big, big margin. I think it was 143 countries to 7, just to ignore what Russia was trying to do. And I do think this was an unexpected diplomatic snafu by the Russians, who seem to have refused to take quite a lot of off-ramps that were being offered to them, and ended up sort of getting beaten quite publicly on an issue which they didn't need to incur reputational damage on.
Why do you think they did this, Richard?
I genuinely don't know. And I'm not surprised that the Russians were being hardline until the last moment. The Russians, I think, have felt a little disrespected during the process because they were raising objections to various points in the text, issues on nuclear weapons being one of them. And the co-facilitators of the process, Germany and Namibia, were not always deferring to the Russian objections. And that was clearly annoying them. And Russia's brand at the UN is being a country that can say no. And obviously in the Security Council, it can say no in a very decisive way with a veto. So I had expected them to hang tough until the last moment, but I'm genuinely perplexed why they didn't drop their amendment with a few minutes to go to avoid public embarrassment. Maybe it was just to show a certain sort of disregard for the whole process. And the Russians have said that they don't feel any particular reason to honor the pact for the future now that it's been agreed.
I mean, yeah, it was just like a fascinating, and as far as these things go, rather dramatic ending to just years of diplomacy leading up to that moment. And, it should be noted that in the end, Russia did not formally block consensus, right? So the pact was adopted by acclamation.
And it's worth saying that this has left a lot of people quite confused. In UN terminology, consensus doesn't mean that every single country has to agree with every single part of a text. I mean, if that was the case, you would never agree anything at the UN. Consensus merely means that the UN member states agree not to vote on an issue. And so that is how you can have Russia and I think at least one other country, Argentina, objecting to the contents of the pact, but it is still said to have been adopted by consensus.
So I am going to have a full episode about what happened at the Summit of the Future and what's in the Pact of the Future and all the outcome documents in the next episode of Global Dispatches. So I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole, but I'd just be kind of curious to hear from you and Anjali, like big picture. Anjali, we'll start with you. What's your take on this whole process thus far in the Summit of the Future?
Well, I think if we were looking for the biggest brush takeaway, right, we might say that a resounding vote like that, even if it isn't every country agreeing on every point, which would be, quite frankly, a miracle, right, shows us that there is interest and investment in the United Nations enduring, which sounds like a ridiculously, easy thing to say, but I don't think that that's necessarily a given, given sort of widespread cynicism about the institution, given sort of, the fact that it patently isn't up to the mark on any number of fronts. The fact that that many countries want it to be revitalized, want it to be revamped, want it to be fit for purpose in the future, I think is notable, right? It shows us something about the appetite for effective multilateralism and effective global governance in the face
Yeah.
of collective problems.
And honestly, this really just energized civil society as well. Like they were some of the key driving force behind this. I know in the end, of course, it's adopted by member states, but civil society was very, very engaged and enthused about this. Richard, what's your kind of big picture takeaway of the whole Summit of the Future process and the outcome?
I think one should say that if people are rushing away from this podcast, downloading the Pact for the Future and expecting to discover a amazingly crystalline vision of the future of the UN, they may be disappointed, because it is a UN document, and you can see going line by line how individual phrases were wordsmithed, almost to the point of incomprehensibility. But nonetheless, it does contain a lot of pretty good ideas, I think pretty good hooks for future policy processes. And there are a few surprises in it. It contains some surprisingly progressive language on the need to accelerate discussions of Security Council reform, for example, which is not something I would necessarily have predicted at the start of the year, when a lot of us assumed that states wouldn't be able to agree anything at all about how to reshape the council. So it's a mess, but it's good to have it. And there's a lot of good that I think can come out of it if member states are serious about implementation. And that's always the big question with these documents. You can sign stuff, you can pledge stuff, but do you actually do it?
So Monday, yesterday, concluded the Summit of the Future. Today, Tuesday, kicks off the general debate at the General Assembly, that parade of speeches by world leaders at the General Assembly. And as tradition goes, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, kicks off with a speech. Anjali, I'll kick it to you. What was your interpretation, your take on Guterres' speech this year?
Yeah, so I mean, as you said, you and Richard and I have been having this conversation for 15 years now.
Since the San Francisco conference.
Yes,
That's
yes.
right.
Yes.
Since the beginning of global governance, we've been sitting down to talk about Antonio Guterres' speech.
Yes.
And it over the years has gotten darker and darker and darker. And as we've said a few times, right, he's gone as far as to invoke the apocalypse and, all kinds of end times imagery, and to essentially tell the assembled world leaders that we are all going to die bloody and fiery deaths and it's their fault. But this year, I was surprised because he had a much more collaborative, more, I would say, forward looking approach to addressing the world leaders. Not to say that this was a resoundingly rosy picture of the world that he was painting, right? He started out by saying that we were living in a whirlwind, right? The state of our world was unsustainable. He said, we can't go on this way, but our problems are solvable if we invest in the global governance solutions that will help us solve them, he told us, if global governance is fit for purpose. And he basically told us that we live in a world with three big drivers of unsustainability, right? That we live in a world of impunity, that we live in a world of inequality, and that we live in a world of uncertainty. And all three of these things push us to the brink of unsustainability. But each one of them has solutions, has tools that we could adopt to push us back from the brink, or to, and use his language, right, to step out of that whirlwind.
Yeah. So, as you noted, in years past, he's invoked hellfire. He's invoked the horsemen of the apocalypse. He's invoked Dante's Inferno. We're moving up, though. We're moving up to purgatory this year. He had this amazing
right.
phrase. I think it's a really punchy and apt phrase, that this world exists today in a, quote, purgatory of polarity. We're not quite a unipolar world. We're not quite a multipolar world. We're in a purgatory of polarity, which I think is actually a very brilliant summation of geopolitics today.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would have been a little obnoxious of the Secretary General if, after member states did sign off on the Pact for the Future, which was originally his initiative, he'd then come back and said, we're still all doomed. So maybe he would have given a rather different speech if, as did seem possible even a week ago, the pact had really fallen apart. But I think that he does seem to have wanted to offer a little more hope. And actually, there was an interesting read over to President Biden, because Biden also talked about the problems of the world. He cited Yeats. I mean, he always loves citing a good Irish poet, and he said, the centre cannot hold. But then he flipped that and he said, but actually the centre is holding. People do still believe in international law. And so I think maybe the message from both Guterres and Biden was, let's not just sort of go into an endless downward spiral. Let's get a grip and try and pull ourselves out of this hole.
Yeah, that's a very good transition and connection between Biden and Guterres. This was Biden's farewell speech at UNGA. I expected, and it was like a grand foreign policy vision, but it was downright optimistic. Quote, "I have hope. I know there's a way forward. Things can get better. Nothing is beyond our capacity if we work together." And as if to hammer this optimistic point home, he even quoted Mandela, quote, "It always seems impossible until it is done." The optimism dripping from Biden's speech, I think itself was notable, especially given the state of the world today, the prospect that he's giving this speech amidst a widening conflict in the most volatile region in the world.
It's also worth saying that, Biden wasn't sort of sounding unrealistically optimistic. He actually started off, looking back over his career as a politician and his time as president. And he talked a lot about some things that had gone wrong. I mean, he expressed, I think, a certain degree of remorse over the loss of US lives in Afghanistan, for example, and the loss of soldiers during the evacuation of Kabul. He was quite frank about some of the things that have gone wrong on his watch. And then he sort of transitioned, as you say, to this sort of stern but nonetheless optimistic message, we can work together. And then he finished with really quite a moving passage where he talked about his decision to stand down. And rather than letting that sort of be an unspoken act of weakness, he actually framed it very nicely as an act of strength. And he said, we've got to recognize that we're not just here as leaders to hold on to power. And he ended by talking about the importance of listening to the people. So it was an interesting speech, a mix of melancholy, but also determination. And I thought it was well done.
It's interesting. The end of that speech, as you cited, in which he references his own decision not to remain in power. I mean, he was speaking directly to those dinosaurs in the room who have been in power forever at the expense of their people. And frankly, that line, he said, "My fellow leaders, let us never forget that some things are more important than staying in power," must have stung many of the delegations in the room, even as it probably delighted many of the people that they ostensibly serve.
Yeah, I think I also interestingly thought of it as slightly less maybe optimistic and more of a sort of a valedictory swan song that covered the big foreign policy sweep of his career, some of which were resounding successes, some of which, as he framed them, were out and out tragedies, right? A lot has been written about Joe Biden as the sort of mourner in chief. And I think you heard that in some of his speech, which isn't to say it was pessimistic, right? It's just to say that it was a sort of revelation of things that he has experienced, right? And how the world has transformed alongside them. And I think, alongside that big speech, there was a real pragmatic optimism about what collaboration could achieve, especially on what democracy could achieve. And you and I have talked about this before. We talked about this in our episode about the 2025 project and how it deals with the United Nations. But, he really drove home the resonance between foundational US documents and the UN Charter with their emphasis on the people, right? And essentially saying, right, like, we the peoples are invested in these projects of power more than we the leaders. And I think that was notable. I do think the rest of the speech, I think for a lot of people in that room, he talked about being at the inflection point in history. He talked about
you might want to hold on 1 second. It's
exactly,
the ambience. Yeah. Well, that's likely Joe Biden, rolling right by your recording studio.
I was on my way to campus yesterday, and they held us for 15 minutes at the corner of 48th and Park, and I actually thought that group of citizens was going to get together and try and invoke the 25th Amendment themselves, because they were
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
In the middle of those two big sort of sweeping valedictory points, there were sort of quick fire addresses to different policy points pressing around the world. He did a quick interlude on Sudan. He talked about AI. He did a little bit on Security Council reform. He did very briefly talk about Gaza, right? And he got sort of, I think, what sounded to me like a little bit of a tepid response in response to calling for a ceasefire to end the war in Gaza. Not because obviously the ceasefire is unpopular in that room. It's very popular in that room, but because it's an uncomfortable thing for them to receive him talking about, I think, to some extent, right? He got a much more, to my ears at least, vibrant round of applause in calling for a two-state solution. So in between these sort of like big valedictory and sort of rousing parts of the speech, I think, was a sense of the fact that it's the US that has snarled the work of so much of the UN in the last year. And there's no getting away from that. Not sort of from the long arc of Joe Biden's career, not from his sort of ability to mourn foreign policy losses in people's lives, right?
Yeah.
It's not even an elephant in the room. It's just the thing in the room.
Yeah. I mean, Richard, looking back over these last 4 years of Biden and the United Nations, I'm struck by the fact that, Joe Biden is, as multilateralist as American presidents can get. He's as transatlanticist. He's as liberal internationalist as American presidents really ever get in this modern era. Yet these last 4 years have been fairly calamitous for the United Nations itself. Like, how do you explain that?
Well, firstly, I'm not sure I entirely agree with your premise, because
Okay.
I think that Biden,
Ideologically, he's predisposed towards liberal internationalism, let's say.
that's certainly true. And he sees that the UN has value, but he is not as interested in building big multilateral deals as Barack Obama was. And, it's worth remembering that in his second term, President Obama played a crucial role in getting us the Paris climate change agreements. The US was very supportive of the Sustainable Development Goals. We don't see Biden's team as interested in those sort of large UN-centric arrangements. I think that this is to do with shifting geopolitics, but Biden's approach to the UN has been more pragmatic. He's used it when he thinks it's helpful, as over Ukraine, as a platform to criticize Russia. But then he's tried to ignore it when he doesn't think it will be helpful, most obviously over Gaza. I would say that if Biden's presidency had ended a year ago, the general view at the UN would have been that it was broadly positive, even if it didn't sort of deliver big wins for the organization. I do think that the reviews now are more ambivalent for precisely the reasons that, even though the US is now pushing for a ceasefire, and Biden did very strongly warn against widening the war into Lebanon, people are not going to easily forget the very, very painful time we had in late 2023 and early 2024 when the US and the White House were just adamantly against the UN pushing for a ceasefire.
I think that the one last point to make is that there's almost no getting around, I think, this sort of fundamental issue also, because part of Guterres' speech was noting, the central role that UN casualties have played in the conflict in Gaza, right? And he asked the room to acknowledge the work of UNRWA, and, the US is still a notable non-funder of UNRWA. And so, those are things that were in stark relief in that room on that day, not just sort of ambient around the General Assembly.
So beyond Biden's speech, Anjali, I'll stick with you. Any other notable speeches? We're wrapping up day one of the speeching part of UNGA. Any notable speeches, any notable other events that you would cite?
I would cite first, Lula had a great one-liner at one point. He said, "Freedom is the first victim of a world with no rules."
Huh.
And
Sounds like a Chris Christopherson lyric or something.
a little bit, maybe. But also Liberia spoke at length about the African role in UN Security Council reform in ways that are resonant with the Pact for the Future, in ways that are resonant with the Biden administration's recent policy proposals. And South Africa spoke at length about the uses of multilateralism in addressing historical injustices and in addressing crimes against humanity. And both, I think, were like rich texts of speeches for people to go back and take a look at if they're interested, not just sort of nuts and bolts and here are 17 things and we're building a new airport kind of takes.
And Richard, any other speeches or events that you'd cite as particularly interesting or notable?
I have to admit that I wasn't able to listen to a lot of the speeches after Biden because, like a lot of people around the UN, I've been sort of trying to dash from meeting to meeting, but getting caught in crowds and actually having very little time to focus on substance. I do think it's worth highlighting President Erdogan from Turkey, who spoke immediately after President Biden and included some pretty tough language about Western double standards and the failure of liberal norms in Gaza. And I think that may have undercut some of what we had heard from the US president immediately beforehand. But I'm going to have to take down notes and follow the Save Us from Hell reading guide and catch up with some of the other leaders once the chaos has simmered down a little bit. There just isn't really enough time to think this week.
Richard, I wanted to ask you, one other kind of big picture question here before we go. So we are having this conversation. UNGA is taking place amidst an escalatory cycle between Hezbollah and Israel. To what extent do you feel that is coloring UNGA itself, is setting the tone for UNGA itself this year?
I think there's no way to avoid the fact that the situation in the Middle East is hovering over everyone's engagement at the UN. And I think it's interesting that in the last couple of weeks, we've been getting quite a lot of signals that the Biden administration in particular, but also a lot of other powers, were hoping to use this week as an opportunity to focus on another crisis, which is the war in Sudan. Because there is a sense that after a period where everyone has been talking about Gaza and Ukraine, we need to recognize that the UN has also been really failing to get a grip on the Sudanese civil war, which has so far driven 10 million people from their home. And I think Secretary of State Blinken and others are going to be involved in side events around Sudan. There was a real urge to push this up the agenda, and that will still happen. But it is possible that events in the Middle East will just suck everyone back in, and leaders won't have the bandwidth to think about a situation like Sudan because they will be so focused on what's happening between Israel and Hezbollah.
So, again, we're speaking towards the tail end of the Tuesday of UNGA. So, Anjali, just over to you first. Any other events in particular or speeches in particular that you're looking forward to hearing later this week?
I know I've said this before, but I'm always interested in going back and taking a look at what the small island nations have to say. We had a couple up today, we had Maldives up today, but I want to go back and take a listen and see, what kinds of multilateral ideas they're putting on the table and what kinds of crises they're raising to people's attention. I'm also interested in seeing, to what extent we hear more dialogue around Sudan, because it was more absent than the Middle Eastern conflicts from the conversation today. I think, for understandable reasons, but it will be interesting to see and important to see, I think, how it plays out in the next few days.
And Richard, any speeches or events that you are particularly looking towards throughout the week?
Well, it's striking that because we had the Summit for the Future, there are slightly fewer really big sort of additional summits and conferences going on around the General Assembly than was the case last year, when I think we had 3 separate global health summits in the week. There is a big meeting on antimicrobial resistance, which a lot of health ministers are in town for, and that's a hugely important theme. I do think that despite my slight concerns, it is really important to see how much leaders say about Sudan. And I do think that that's one crisis where a strong message about the need for ending hostilities from the General Assembly could have a really positive effect on ongoing mediation efforts and humanitarian efforts. And if that does prove to be possible, then I think this week will have had real value, even if I don't see the week making an enormous difference in terms of diplomacy either over the Middle East or indeed Ukraine.
Well, Richard, thank you so much as always, and we'll do this again in for the next 80 years.
Thanks so much, Richard.
It's always good to mark the beginning of fall with these conversations.
Thank you for listening to Save Us from Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us from Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.